This video is a companion to my tutorial on creating a scrap journal. You can see the complete tutorial on creating the scrap journal in the full video here. This video will show you some of the details of the techniques I use in the initial creation of the signatures before I bind them together, as well as other techniques that I use once the pages are bound. It may feel a little disjointed because I'm mostly just mentioning techniques as I think of them, so if you have any questions, just leave them down in the comments. The pages I created for this particular scrap journal are fairly thick and substantial, so each signature is a single folded piece known as a folio. Most of these consist of combinations of book cloth and paper that have been sewn and glued together. In all cases, the base layer was either book cloth, which has been backed with rice paper, heavy paper, or paper that has been glued together. I like this because these materials all give the pages more body than if they were just made from plain fabric with no backing. However, there's certainly no rule saying you can't use plain fabric. It will just give your book a different look and feel. Here's an example of the process I went through with one of the signatures. It started with a piece of book cloth that I had printed an image from an old book on. It wasn't big enough for the size signature I was making, so I needed to add to it in some way. I decided to sew other fabric onto the bottom of the page to get to the 11 by 7.5 size that I needed. I chose a couple of pieces of regular fabric that I sewed together and then sewed to the book cloth to make it bigger, as well as more interesting. Before sewing up the other side of that additional fabric, I decided to sew some paper images onto that page, both front and back. You can see how it's much easier doing this kind of work before any binding takes place. Next, I constructed a piece for the outside of this signature. This consisted of an image that I covered with a piece of translucent rice paper. You can buy lots of beautiful rice paper for this kind of work at very reasonable prices on Amazon. I'll put a link in my description below. I usually use a glue stick for this kind of work because it dries quickly and doesn't curl the paper as badly as PVA glue. I do make sure the glue stick is archival or acid-free. Some are and some aren't. If it doesn't say right on the stick that it's acid-free, then assume that it isn't. When I'm gluing a thin paper to another piece, I will sometimes do this one half at a time, particularly if the piece I'm gluing is fairly large or if I want the placement to be exact, as was the case here. I like to use washi tapes on my scrap journals. These come in a wide variety of widths and a huge variety of patterns. I can always find ones that suit my aesthetic. They are like a light version of masking tape, and they are archival, both the rice paper they are printed on and the adhesive. One of the many cool things about washi tape is that the adhesive is not so strong that you can't pull up a piece of tape and reposition it. I'm careful when I do this on delicate paper though, like rice paper, because it will sometimes pick up fibers from that paper. This is seldom a big deal when I'm working on my scrap journals. For the spine edges, I often reinforce a fold with plain fabric that hasn't been backed with rice paper. I will also use regular fabric to create a hinge if I have two pieces of paper that I want to join together. Or sometimes I do this just for the decorative nature of it. And here's another great use for washi tape. Since the adhesive isn't super strong and it doesn't leave any residue behind, I use it to temporarily tape down things that I want to sew, like this piece of fabric for the spine. That might seem like a wasteful use for washi tape, but I have enough rolls of this stuff to last me several lifetimes, so I don't worry too much about that. One word of warning though, when you're sewing pieces that have been taped together, if you sew over the tape, be aware that you may end up with a gummy adhesive on your needle. I sew over this tape on purpose on occasion, but I am cautious about it and I clean my needle off immediately after so as not to gum up the bobbin area of my machine. If you do sew over your washi tape, do it understanding the risk. Additionally, the thing that makes washi tape so easy to use, its ability to be so easily repositioned, is also a bit of a detriment for something like a scrap journal where you want some permanence to the objects that you place. So once I'm sure I have my tape where I want it, I will almost always then glue it down more permanently with a glue stick, and sometimes I will even cover it with a very light coating of PVA glue. I do this particularly if the tape is running down the center of a fold, which I will do sometimes to cover up the sewing. The PVA glue helps it to stay put and is flexible when it dries, so it's perfect for this purpose. If you use too heavy of a coat of PVA, it will end up with a shine to it, but if you put it on very thinly, this won't happen. Don't be afraid to take risks with your pages, particularly before you've bound them. If something you try goes completely south, then you can always jettison a page. This is an example of a page that I kept trying to salvage but finally gave up on because the structure was getting harder and harder to fold and manage. I had created a problem by trying to use a heavy ribbon sewn into the spine, and it just kept getting worse from there. I did like the basic page a lot though, so I recreated the parts that worked. As far as embellishing the pages after they've been bound, I do a lot of rubber stamping with alphabet stamps, but also with my own stamps that I've carved from a rubbery material that is perfect for this process. You can see how to carve your own stamps in my video here. I use stamp pads for this part of the process, and I also use paint. Sometimes I will even use printing ink, the kind that I use when I print my linotypes. It depends on the effect I want. The ink from the stamp pads, as a rule, tends to be rather transparent and allows the background to show through somewhat. When I use paint, I like to use gouache paint because it is very opaque, water-soluble, and I can mix exactly the color I want, which I can't do with stamp pads. It cleans up easily with water, and whatever I don't use, I allow to dry, and then I just reconstitute it with water later on, something you can't do with acrylic paint. I like that it is very opaque, much more so than regular watercolors. It is also very thick, so I can get a little texture or dimension to what I'm stamping if I want that effect. The color white is a good example of when I might use gouache instead of ink. White is nearly impossible to get from a stamp pad, but gouache gives you a nice bright opaque white. It works with large stamps and also works with small alphabet stamps. I almost always use a glue stick when adding images or rice paper to the book. It tends to curl less than PVA glue, which has a lot more moisture in it, and it dries faster too, for the same reason. I always weight freshly glued areas down briefly just to make sure they're firmly stuck down. Soft weights are perfect for this. Don't be afraid to glue paper down across pages, particularly light papers like rice paper. Lighter papers should fold quite easily and not force your book to spring open. If the paper is really large, I usually do this in 2 steps, gluing one half down first and then applying glue to the second half. This makes it easier because it gives you something to hold on to while placing the first half down without having everything stick to your fingers. I also like to print images on tracing paper. You can get some very interesting effects from the combination of the image on top and what is in the background. Tracing paper curls up immediately when it gets damp, so gluing it can be a little tricky. This is another instance when gluing down a half at a time can be very useful in terms of handling the paper. So those are just a few of the many different techniques you can use when constructing your scrap journal. I'll add some links down in the description for the rice paper and gouache paint, as well as for the rubber backing that you can use to carve your own rubber stamps.